Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program. Usually at Economic Growth, we look at short-term and medium-term trends in the next few years or the next couple of decades. But in the long term, there's the matter of centuries and millennia. Probably apart from natural resources, the single most important aspect of economic growth has to do with demography. If you look at the U.S. Census, in the year 2100, depending on the assumptions, the United States could have a population anywhere between slightly higher than it is now, 310 million, and more than 1 billion people. So that's kind of, 500, 600 million person room for error. And in areas from Social Security to infrastructure, you have to plan in these 30, 50, sometimes even 75, 80-year increments. So demography is a very important part of thinking about the future, not just of the economy, but of society. And we're privileged to have with us today one of the world's leading experts on demographic trends. Eric Kaufmann is professor of politics at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He was a fellow in religion and international affairs program at the Belfer Center of the Kennedy School at Harvard from 2008 to 2009. In 2008, he won the Richard Rose Prize of the Political Studies Association for work by a scholar under 40. He's the author of the book that he'll talk about today, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? Copies of which are available to those of you in the audience. It's been reviewed in, among others, The Times, The Financial Times, The Independent, Observer. He's also author of The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, The Orange Order, A Contemporary Northern Irish History, co-author of Unionism and Orangism in Northern Ireland since 1945, and editor of Rethinking Ethnicity, Majority Groups and Dominant Minorities. Eric Kaufmann is co-editor of two forthcoming books, Political Demography, Identity, Institutions, and Conflict, and Wither the Child, Causes and Consequences of Low Fertility. He's an editor of the journal Nations and Nationalism, and has written on religion and demography for Newsweek, International Foreign Policy, and Prospect magazines. So please join me in welcoming Eric Kaufmann.
Thanks, Mike. And first of all, apologies, I don't have a British accent. I'm actually Canadian, but have wound up in London been there for over 15 years. I'd like to thank New America and especially Mike Lind for setting this up. A couple of, both Mike and Phil Longman, who's also here at New America and who are both quoted here, have influenced my thinking on this issue quite a bit and did pioneering work on this. I recall going out and getting Phil Longman's book, Empty Cradle, and some of his insights on the demography of religion, which I found quite interesting. And I've kind of tried to take a magnifying glass to that and develop it a little bit. And sort of blended in with some of what we know about trends in the sociology and politics of religion worldwide. Now, first a word about political demography. Some of you may have heard Yogi Berra's saying it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But what demography allows you to do is to make better predictions, let's say, because it is the most predictable of the social sciences. So, for example, the 50-somethings of the 2050s have already been born, so we know something about their characteristics. Perhaps they're more Hispanic than the average. Perhaps they have different views than the average. It's not that things can't change, but in certain respects, demography gives you a good insight into what the future may hold socially and politically. So I just want to start with these two quotations from Mike and Phil. Phil wrote, what's the difference between, I think this is a great statistic, difference between Seattle and Salt Lake City. In Seattle, there are nearly 45% more dogs than children, and in Salt Lake City, 19% more kids than dogs. Or Mike makes the observation amongst white Americans that fertility differences reflect a gulf between the religious and the secular. Comparing again Utah, very conservative religious state, Republican voting, where there are 90 children for every 1,000 women, versus liberal democratic Vermont. And I'll show you in a minute. This is a study that confirms pretty well what Mike was saying, a study by demographer Ron Listaga in 2006, which shows us almost 80% correlation between the total fertility rate, which is the number of children a woman will bear in her lifetime for white women in a state, and the percentage vote for Bush. So you'll see Utah. See if this laser works. Yeah, so you can see Utah way out here with and Idaho, two Mormon-influenced states with very high total fertility rates and very strong Republican support. And then down here we have the New England states with very low European levels of fertility and very low support for Bush. So there's a link, it seems, and this is one of the links which I'm hoping to be able to flesh out here today. But at the same time, we also have to look at social trends and trends in the sociology of religion, which seem to be going the other way. Because if we take this argument that religious women have more children, we should expect the religious population, particularly the conservative religious population, to be increasing in different countries of the world. However, at the same time, we're hearing unprecedented news about the decline of religion. And here's a piece that came out quite recently. The headline reads, "Religion may become extinct in 9 nations, including Canada," where I'm from. The study says, and this is based on a mathematical model which using statistics on the decline of religious observance in these countries, and says, well, really what we're facing is secularization. And even in the United States, David Briggs, who's a very keen observer of religious trends in America, argues, drawing upon the work of people like Mark Chavez, says we have a tremendous rise in the number of young Americans who say they have no religion. Almost unprecedented. Robert Putnam makes the same argument. It's almost at European levels. And so perhaps the U.S. too is following in that path of secularization that people argue we see in Europe. So which is the story? Is it religious decline or is it religious resurgence through demography? And that's kind of the question that I tried to answer in this book, is to say, let's look at the demographic forces which seem to be associated with rising religiosity and conservative religiosity, and on the other hand, look at secularization, which seems to be associated with decline, which is a different trajectory. Which one is more powerful if we're to look into the future? So which story is right? Now, I've got many slides here to do with the demography of religion in the U.S. to 2050 and the demography of the political parties in the U.S. and Islam in Europe and so forth. I'm not actually going to show you those now. We can look at them in the Q&A, just because of you may have heard the phrase "absolute PowerPoint corrupts absolutely." So I don't want to hit you with too many slides. What I want to do, what I want to start with then, is to begin in Israel, which I think is a paradigm case for what I'm talking about, which could be a model for what we might see in the future, in a couple of centuries, of course. And then I'll talk about the near term and medium term. But I'll start with Israel. In 2003, in an event which didn't make the headlines in the New York Times, but I think we might, in retrospect, see as very significant, Uri Lupoliansky became Jerusalem's first ultra-Orthodox mayor. Now, why is this important? Well, Lupoliansky succeeded for 2 reasons. One is the tremendous increase in the ultra-Orthodox population in Jerusalem, and secondly, because the ultra-Orthodox mobilized to the tune of 90% in terms of voting for Lupoliansky. So this combination of strong electoral cohesion plus population growth is what propels Lupoliansky into office. And I think, even though Lupoliansky subsequently lost, there's an inevitability there that we're going to see a dominance of the Jerusalem mayor's office, which can be compared to, for example, the Irish domination of the Chicago mayor's office, at least until the retirement of Mayor Daley. But anyway, this long dominance does seem to be in the cards. And really what's happened in Israel is truly remarkable. The rise of the ultra-Orthodox, not only in Israel but in the Jewish diaspora. This is a newspaper published out of London's ultra-Orthodox community, Jewish Tribune. And here this headline of several years ago says, "We are heading for a majority by 2050. And this is actually based upon research done in both Britain and the US, which shows that indeed, based on present growth rates, the ultra-Orthodox will form a majority of observant Jews in Israel and the US around 2050 or just a bit thereafter, based on the fact that currently the ultra-Orthodox make up 17% of British Jews. That's whereas on the other hand, 75% of births to observant Jews in Britain are ultra-Orthodox. It gives you an indication of the magnitude of the fertility advantage of the ultra-Orthodox over mainstream Jews. In Israel, now of course, Jews are a small part of the American and British populations, but in Israel, they're a bigger fish in a smaller pond, and so that means they're going to have a disproportionate impact. Dan Ben David, who is a leading Israeli demographer based at the Taub Center in Tel Aviv University, has done a lot of very interesting work with statistics on the ultra-Orthodox. And this is just a graph showing primary school pupils by educational stream. The red graph here is, now this doesn't disaggregate between ultra-Orthodox Jews and Arab Israelis. Both of these groups are nominally anti-Zionist, have high unemployment, high welfare dependency, and don't serve in the military. So this is a concern for Israeli policymakers. And you can see that both of these groups combined made up only 15% of the Israeli primary school system in 1960. Today, we're at about 50-50 between ultra-Orthodox plus Arab and the rest, which are basically secular Jews, but not only secular Jews, also modern Orthodox. And by the time we get to 2040, that's expected to be pushing 80% of the primary school population. And from political demography, we're to take that forward, these people are going to be hitting the electorate after a delay of about 10 years. And so what impact is this going to have on Israeli politics? And I can get into that. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but it will affect, for example, the peace process. It's also affecting the Israeli economy. And this is sort of a new issue which hasn't been brought to light, but it's interesting that Israel's economic growth rate really started to taper off after the early 1970s, much more so than in other OECD countries. And in fact, Israel's economic performance has lagged considerably. And one of the reasons which Ben David and others point to is, in fact, this very high dependent population that has low employment, poor economic performance, and also high welfare dependency, because the ultra-Orthodox men tend to study at yeshiva into their 40s and beyond. They don't tend to work. And so this tends to be a net drain on the Israeli economy. And recently, Bank of Israel Governor Stanley Fischer and a number of leading Israeli economists have warned that there could be a catastrophe in the Israeli economy within 10 years. So there could be a bankruptcy of the Israeli welfare state as a result of this if something isn't done either to integrate the Haredim or the ultra-Orthodox into the mainstream. But of course, the ultra-Orthodox are strenuously resisting that because their ideal is one of the scholar society. But there are a couple of lessons then that we can draw from the Israeli case. I know it's an extreme case, but it's worth noting a couple of things. First of all, that demography can change society quite radically. And so demography can propel religious fundamentalism, can desecularize a society. So some of these assumptions that societies are inevitably moving in a secular, liberal direction, I think need to be questioned. I mean, the Israeli case clearly shows that this has not occurred. In fact, there's been movement in the other direction. Secondly, what happened in Israel in terms of birth rates is that the divide between rich and poor, educated and uneducated, in other words, the material drivers of family size, faded. And you can see that best with the Oriental Jews who came from North Africa and other parts of the Muslim world. And their birth rates actually came down to the European Jews level. However, what didn't come down were the birth rates of the ultra-Orthodox, whether they were European Jews or Oriental Jews. So it seems like those who made it a mission of theirs to resist the demographic transition, their birth rates did not come down. If anything, they went up. And so it's a shift from material to cultural drivers of fertility. And that's one of the reasons or one of the ways I'm going to try and connect the Israeli case to the rest of the world. Because in the rest of the world, we see the same phenomena. That is, culture is playing a much bigger role in determining family size than it had in the past. Something which is known in demography as second demographic transition theory. This comes about for several reasons. And one of the most important is that with urbanization, you no longer have to have lots of kids to work the land. With contraception, you, in fact, can plan and control your family size. So a lot of the material forces which meant that you had to have a lot of kids. First of all, many died. You didn't have good medical care, so you had high infant mortality. You needed hands to work the land. You didn't have reliable contraception. Well, all of that's been largely taken care of. And so now family size becomes a choice. As Wolfgang Lutz, a well-known demographer, puts it, the link between sex and procreation has been broken. And so once family size becomes a choice rather than a necessity, this is where values come to play a bigger role. And that's why, and the research on this in all parts of the world show, the more modern a society, the bigger the cultural gap on fertility. And so in the Muslim world, in the cities of the Muslim world, the gap between sort of strong supporters of Sharia and those who are opposed to Sharia in terms of family size is largest. Whereas in the countryside, everyone more or less has larger families because either they have to or for traditional reasons. So again, this link of second demographic transition. It's not that the connection is not as extreme in, say, Europe or the United States as it is in Israel, but it's there nonetheless. And it's not the case that change has to be so quick. I mean, you can have a situation where even if there's a half-child gap between fundamentalists and seculars, if that's maintained over generations, it can lead to astonishing social change. For example, Rod Stark, in his book, The Rise of Christianity, talks about early Christianity and how the number of Christian converts increased from 40 in the year 30 to 6 million in the year 300, just before it became the religion of the Roman Empire. So that increase, and he theorizes and he looks at he says, well, actually, all it would take would be growth of 40% per decade through higher fertility and also somewhat lower mortality to produce this effect, which is incidentally the same level of growth that the Mormons have maintained since their founding in 1830. So over time, the compounding effect of higher birth rates, more mothers, having more children, etc., that advantage can be quite astounding and lead to quite a large transformation. But that, I still think for some people, this still seems a little bit conjectural. How has this actually ever happened? Is this happening? I hope to show in a minute that it has happened and has happened in the 20th century. This idea that demography can radically change the ethos of a society. So I've talked a fair bit now about developments which are perhaps centuries away. So the radical transformation, for example, of the West through this process of religious demography may be centuries away. By the time the Amish and Quiverful and the Salafi Muslims and the ultra-Orthodox grow to a sufficient size, so it's nothing we have to worry about, right? I mean, in a way, John Maynard Keynes' quip, in the long run, we're all dead. And of course, Keynes has enjoyed a renaissance, hasn't he, since the financial crisis? But that is relevant. So I want to try and look at some of the more contemporary developments, outriders of this theory, which involve other parts of the world. This is a map of the world by fertility rates, and anything that's in blue indicates a part of the world where fertility is at or below replacement. And if you'll have looked at Phil Longman's book or that of many others, you'll know that, in fact, the fertility rate of the entire world is going to be at or below replacement by the end of the 21st century. Some say it could be much sooner than that. Already, there are many countries in the developing world, such as Brazil, such as Algeria, such as Iran, which have below replacement fertility. That is, roughly 2 children per woman on average. So enough to replace the population or less. Hopefully what you can see from this map is that the places that are colored, where you have above replacement fertility, are largely in the developing world, obviously. And we're entering, between now and 2050, onto the stage of a major and unprecedented demographic revolution in human history. Never before have humans voluntarily limited their fertility, which has led to population decline, and also the dissonance, the distinction between the parts of the world where you still have population explosion and the parts of the world where populations are aging and declining will reach its apogee, its maximum, in 2050. So we're in a phase now where the gap between the parts of the world that are aging and shrinking and the parts of the world that are growing, where there's still population explosion, is going to reach its peak. And that's going to create an awful lot of population pressure from the global south to the developed world, particularly the West, Europe and North America, expressing itself also in the form of global migration. Just to give you a sense of the proportions we're talking about, in 1950, there were 2.5 Europeans for every African, and in 2050, there will be 4 Africans for every European. So that is a kind of, just to give you a sense of the kind of demographic shifts that I'm talking about, that revolution, if you like. So what does this mean for religion, this massive shift in demographic power into the developed world, or developing world? Well, first of all, there's a correlation between religiosity and fertility in the sense that the parts of the world, East Asia and the West, that have below replacement fertility are also the most secular parts of the world, whereas the religious tropics, which are growing quite rapidly between now and 2050, are almost uniformly religious. And when I say religious, 95% or so of the population have a religious affiliation. And what this is, just simply in terms of mathematics, what this means is that the world as a whole is getting more religious, not less religious, as a result of these disparate population growth patterns. So, for example, just to make this, so you can visualize this a bit better, the link between demography, or population change, and religion runs through birth, because most people get religion the old-fashioned way, which is through birth. And so that link between birth, then, and religious identity is the link between demography and religion. It comes through birth. So if there's a lot of religious babies being born in the developing world, that's going to mean the world as a whole is becoming more religious. And in fact, as work by the World Religious Database and also the Gallup World Poll, as work by both of these have shown, in fact, the proportion of the world that is religious increased from 81% in 1970 to 85% in 2000, and is expected to rise to 87% by 2025. So we can't see the story of secularization globally. But many will say, okay, it's just a matter of time. That's all happening in the developing world. Eventually, and it's true, the fertility rates are coming down in the developing world. They too will become secular like us up here in the north. But I think that's questionable for a number of reasons, one of which has to do now with the sociology of religion, and that is it's the interaction between these big global demographic changes and the sociology of religion, in which we're seeing polarization. So traditional religions are being polarized into either secularism or fundamentalism, which is a reaction to secularism. So they're both modern. And this is one of the things people have difficulty with, is that fundamentalism is actually a modern movement. It's a response to the challenge of secularism. And if you are if you're responding to secularism, in a way you're inoculated to a larger extent from the challenge of secularism. And this is one of the reasons why we may not expect to see people shedding their religion as they become wealthier and better educated. They may, in fact, reaffirm that religion. There's another aspect to this too, and that has to do with ethnic identity. So you have global migration, for example, from the developing world to the developed world due to this population imbalance. And when immigrants come into the developed world, they differ often in terms of their religion. So a great example is simply Muslims in Europe. And even secularization theorists will argue that where religion finds secular work to do, it remains relevant. And so, for example, where Islam finds secular work as a prop of identity, of ethnic identity, it can remain relevant. Why is Catholicism so strong in Poland? Well, it's partly because the Catholic Church is seen as a major element of Polish identity in the past, in the face of Soviet occupation, for example. And so that gives Catholicism a relevance. Or likewise with Orthodoxy in Greece. The Orthodox Church has done very well in Greece because it's so closely tied to what it means to be Greek. And in terms of immigration, Islam is doing very well in part because it's tied to what it means to be Bangladeshi, Moroccan, Turkish in the context of Europe. And so that cultural defense argument, so it's because one of the arguments that's put against this thesis is that actually, yes, the immigrants are religious when they arrive, but their children will assimilate into the secular mainstream. We're not seeing this. In fact, all the data we have on the second generation, particularly of Muslims, but also Sikhs, Hindus, and other non-Christians in Europe, shows that the children of the immigrants are no less religious than their parents. And their rates of intermarriage with the host population are very low. The only group that seems to have assimilated to any large extent to the secular mainstream are Afro-Caribbeans. And I'm speaking specifically about West Indians in Britain or Antilleans in Holland. Groups which were Christian and therefore perhaps more amenable to being secularized. And so the combination then of this disparate population growth with cultural defense suggests to me anyway that we're not going to see an erosion of religion in the West through assimilation. And lo and behold, if we look at the statistics from London, where I live, you can see that London is actually a more religious place now than it was 20 years ago. So in Israel, we saw that it was very clear that Israel is a more conservatively religious society now than it was 20 years ago. So too in the gateway immigrant cities of the West, I think you could make the same argument. So in London, for example, the number of practicing Christians remained effectively flat between the late 1980s and the 2000s, while dropping 40% in the rest of the country. And that, of course, doesn't include Muslims, of whom there are as many Muslims going to mosque each week as those Church of England or Anglicans attending Church of England services. So you put the Muslims together with the Christians and the Hindus and others, and London as a whole more religious than it was. And that kind of exemplifies what I'm talking about, that demography can really make a difference to secularization. So in fact, it turns out that if you look into a typical London church, roughly 60% or more of the parishioners are non-white, and many of the rest are East European immigrants. It's no mystery as to why Christianity is doing reasonably well in London. So demography can affect society. People are quite comfortable, or many people would say they're quite comfortable with the idea of ethnic change. People can see that immigration leads to ethnic change. It's harder for people to admit, or at least to acknowledge, that demography can also change the ethos of a society. So ethnic change can bring religious change. And I think this is sort of what's happened in Europe. In the United States, too, for example, if you just talk about social change in terms of religion, it's true that Catholicism sheds a lot of members. Ex-Catholics are one of the largest religions in America. So this is true. But at the same time, Catholicism is growing as never before. And it may be the case, in fact, some of the projections that I've done with some colleagues suggest that by 2050, Catholics could be the largest religion. They could be more Catholics as a percentage of the population of those under 5 years of age in America than Protestants. And that's not because everybody's flocking to Catholicism. It's just because of the demography of Latino Catholic immigration and fertility. So it's not that switching is unimportant. It's not that secularization is unimportant. It's just that it may not be strong enough to offset the demographics. And in fact, what a lot of secularization theorists will do is just look at, if you imagine a bathtub, they'll just look at what's going down the drain and they won't look at what's coming in through the tap. Or they'll say, okay, well, let's bracket what's coming in through the tap because that's temporary. And let's just look at the established population. And this is what Steve Bruce does in Europe, for example, and says, okay, yes, there's immigrants, but let's just look at the host population. We can see they're becoming a lot more secular. But actually, I don't think you can do that. I think you always have to bear in mind there's a constant demographic flow. It's not going to go away. In fact, the ethnic makeup of London is going to be the ethnic makeup of Britain as a whole in 2050. So England and Wales will look like London does today. And as a result, I think that the religious picture in England as a whole is going to look like as London is today. So we have to constantly bear in mind that demography is not a one-off, but it's a constant process. And that's even if immigration stopped, because the Muslim population is much younger than that of the country as a whole. But still, I think there is a sense in which, and I'm a political scientist, and most of my colleagues do not like demography. They don't like the idea that something as crude and as animalistic as demography can change something as noble as the ethos of a society. But I think you can see, even in the 20th century, a number of cases where this has made a difference. If we take the Muslim world and the rise of Islamism post-1970, for example, why did this happen? And if you look at Gilles Kepel's work, there's no question that disillusionment with with Arabism and with non-aligned socialism plays an important role. But it's also true that the demography, this large-scale shift of population from the pious countryside into what had been quite secular cities like Tehran and Algiers, Cairo, etc. So the shift of population, of this religious population, into relatively secular centers in some way overwhelmed those centers, in some way created a constituency that could then be mobilized when the winds shifted away from Arab nationalism towards Islamism. So in the same thing, I think you could argue for the United States, the growth of evangelical Protestantism amongst white Americans, work by Mike Hout, Andrew Greeley, and Melissa Wild in 2001, a famous article, tried to explain how it was the case that amongst white American Protestants born in 1900, barely more than a third were fundamentalists or evangelical. This is a term that's used by the General Social Survey. But conservative Protestants, whereas by the time we get to white Americans born in 1975, it's a majority. It's in fact almost two-thirds of white Protestants that are fundamentalists or evangelical. And in fact, they explain this as the outcome not so much of Episcopalians flocking to the Southern Baptists, but actually of demography. That is, a one-child advantage of conservative over liberal Protestants maintained through much of the 20th century accounts for 3/4 of this development. So that, too, then becomes important when this now is a much larger constituency, and then it's mobilized by Reagan in the 1980s. So that, too, I think exemplifies this idea that demographics can change society, can change religion. And that, right, now, so I began this talk by talking about Israel, talking about a situation in which a fundamentalist group has lots of children for theological reasons, because they believe in traditional women's roles, because they believe in go forth and multiply and other, take the text literally. In this case, when I talk about the rise of evangelicals, the rise of Islamism, it's more indirect. The effect is more indirect, and similarly with immigrants. They have lots of children more because they're poorer than average and less well-educated. And so you could argue this is a temporary effect, and in fact, people like Ron Engelhardt and Pippa Norris make that argument. They say, well, in the long run, the supply of these religious immigrants to the secular parts of the world will dry up. It'll eventually dry up, and then we'll get the world as a whole becoming less religious instead of becoming more religious, as they acknowledge it is already becoming. But again, I would say that in that very long run, that is when some of the dynamics I talked about with regard to the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, by then these closed, world-denying fundamentalist sects with their high rates of reproduction will become a factor in 2 centuries. The Amish and the Salafi Islam and perhaps the neo-fundamentalist Protestants will be a bigger force, partly because world population as a whole will be declining. And one of the themes of my book is it I argue, well, if you look at the ideas of the Enlightenment, secularism, modernity, they accompanied a period of quite large-scale population growth in the world, really unprecedented population growth. I have a graph in here. Hang on. No, I'm not going to be able to get to this, sorry. But anyway, so the ideas that accompany the great explosion of world population post-1700, I don't think it's clear that those are going to be the same ideas that accompany the flattening and eventual decline of world population. And in fact, as John Gray has elegantly written, there's nothing that's etched in stone that we're inevitably moving towards a more secular, liberal, quote-unquote, end of history type scenario. In fact, something quite different could occur. We could be entering a phase that is more religiously conservative. I'm happy to talk about the politics of this. I mean, some have said, well, it's one thing to talk about Israel, where you have a relatively homogeneous Jewish population, or a Muslim country like Algeria or Egypt, where you have a relatively strong religious majority. But what about a country like the U.S. or in Western Europe, where it'll be a mishmash of Muslims and Catholics and Protestants and Hindus and various different religious groups? How are we going to see the same kind of religious politics playing out? And I would just say that on particular issues, religious fundamentalists have been quite good at cooperating across lines of faith and ethnicity. You can see that. You can see it in Britain. You can see it even in the United States. If you think about, for example, Proposition 8 in California in 2008, that was really a combined effort from Latino Catholics, evangelicals, Mormons, African-American Protestants. They all came together on that issue of concern to them. So it is possible for these groups to come together on issues of concern to them. And likewise, even globally, in the 1990s, there was a real concerted effort to combat the women's reproductive rights agenda, the women's equality agenda, and family planning. And this was an effort that was coordinated by the Vatican in combination with evangelicals and Mormon groups, as well as both Sunni fundamentalists and Iranian Shiite mullahs. So you actually had this quite remarkable constellation coming together where the interests converge. So it's not the case that just because you have a diverse society, you won't get convergence. I'm going to end it now just to say that the gist of what I'm saying is that because of global demographic trends, not only is continued and eventual world secularization unlikely, but I think as we pass through population decline and what will effectively be a kind of population bottleneck until we get the next increase in population, I think this is going to amplify the influence of religion, particularly religious fundamentalism. Leave it there.
We want to take questions now. Questions from the audience? So provocative, right here in the middle.
I was going to maybe show slides in response. Is that
Okay,
possible?
we'll
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Could you speak a bit about China, a-religious, low fertility rates, and 1/7 of the world's population, and whether that has an impact or not?
Yeah, China is an interesting case. I didn't really look as much at the outside the Abrahamic world, but if you look at China, you notice a few things. One is that fertility is exceptionally low, obviously. It's a relatively secular society. Yes, Christianity is growing, of course, but you could make the argument again that there's that link between secularism and low fertility in China. In fact, it's the case that by 2030, China will be an older society than the United States. So yes, it's got a large population, which will be important, but I think it doesn't contravene the general argument about this link between population decline and secularism. So it will become a declining part of the world. In fact, in Shanghai, I think the total fertility rate now is around 0.7 children per woman. I mean, so it's not the case that some people have said, well, once China lifts the one-child policy, all of a sudden you're going to get much higher fertility. I mean, I think the evidence is that particularly in coastal China, where the one-child policy isn't really in effect, fertility has continued to go down, because once fertility drops to that level, it's actually very difficult to get people to change back up to replacement. I mean, many governments are trying to do that without success. So, yeah.
What about modern communications? Does that tend to break down fundamentalism in favor of secularism?
Modern, you mean such as the internet or satellite TV?
Arab Spring type of.
Well, the Arab Spring, I mean, I have my own views on the Arab Spring, but I mean, in terms of modern communication technologies, I think it can go either way. You can see where, for example, modern communications can link ultra-Orthodox followers of particular rabbis together globally. It can link Salafi Muslims into a network globally. So it can do that. It can also spread the secular message. I've never been a believer in this medium is the message stuff, which my countryman Marshall McLuhan trotted out in the 1960s. I actually don't think the medium makes much difference. I think it's the message really that counts. So I wouldn't argue that global communications would skew it either way. Yeah.
Doesn't your projection depend on women being willing to continue to play a conservative role or being forced to play a conservative role? And that's the premise of your projections.
Yes. Well, I think it's the case. I mean, if you look at these conservative religious groups, they do reject modern women's roles. And so women are socialized this way, and the ultra-Orthodox women, what counts to them is not how much money a potential mate has, but how good a scholar they are. So they're socialized to choose a mate on that basis. They're quite happy having lots of children, having 10, 12, 13 children. In fact, this becomes a matter of competition, and there is a mother instinct, which I'm told. In fact, there are. I teach. I teach at a university which is all evening teaching, and what this means actually is that it's one of the few places that you can be ultra-Orthodox and attend. So there are about 3 or 4 ultra-Orthodox students in this university, I'm told, because they all know each other, and I know one of them. And because it's in the evening, they can pretend that they're studying during the day, Torah, of course, but in the evening they can kind of pretend that they're doing something else. But no, their argument is really that women are quite content. There isn't a lot of agitation to be modern women. So I'm not convinced that it's inevitable that women are going to demand the right to go out and work. I think it seems to be a relatively sustainable model. So.
Could you expand on your argument that immigrants from the third world to the first world will lose their religiosity? It seems counterintuitive, and as one gets richer, better educated, right? So,
you mean that
expand.
They won't?
What's your data that would argue
right
in your
here we go.
favor?
Okay. Let me just show you a little bit of data here. Hang on. On this. Okay, this is one set of surveys that were done in Britain. There's a lot of data there, but I'll try and point you through it. Just as a kind of, I'm basing a lot of this on ethnic minority surveys, also a little bit on longitudinal surveys targeted at minority populations. But what you see are different patterns. So here in Britain, these bricked up bars are the second generation, the British-born. In this case, brown refers to, here we're talking about Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. This is Afro-Caribbeans, and this is East European. And the solid line is the first generation. And this is in terms of attendance at worship. You can see the Bangladeshi and Pakistani Muslim first and second generations at exactly the same level there of almost 40% weekly attendance at services. And in terms of retention of religious practice, I mean, there's a slight decline, but it's still extremely high. I mean, this is an ambiguous type of question. But what that's suggesting is that there's very little secularization or religious decline between the first and second generation. And actually, if you look at questions to do with, should people attend Muslim religious schools, should women wear the veil, Sharia law, in those sorts of questions, the under 35 Muslims in Europe are actually more conservative than the over 55s. So the parents might not have worn the veil, the children wear the veil or want to. So there's quite powerful evidence that there's been this, that the second generation is retaining the religion. Sorry, just a contrast here with the Afro-Caribbean, where the first generation, 50% are attending typically church, often Pentecostal or Anglican or Catholic, whereas the second generation much less. And that's partly reflecting high intermarriage. So the particularly West Indian population is intermarried roughly, I guess of every 2 marriages involving a black Caribbean, 1 is with a white. So that, whereas for Muslims, South Asians, it's much less than 10%. And that's a similar thing in Germany. An exception, the only country that's really an exception in Europe is France, because of a very peculiar origin of its Muslim population from Algeria. And a lot of those people were Berbers who have a history of conflict with the state. So they're in some way anti-Islamist already. And so they're easier to, they're more amenable to being secularized, whereas it's not the case for those in the rest of Western Europe. I could talk about intermarriage rates, which basically bear out similar types of relationships, very low intermarriage amongst Muslim ethnic groups. And actually, this is misleading. It's less than 10% intermarriage, because this includes people who are of other Muslim sects, like the Ahmadis and others. So.
I'm very interested in this combination of the demographic and sociological forces coming together. And what I'm wondering is, assuming that demographic forces are inexorably pushing, religious fundamentalism to become a majority in many countries, what then will be the sociological impact on those groups of being the majority? With,
Right.
The major secular threat removed, what will happen will sort of paradoxically more secularization suddenly start to
Right.
occur?
Yeah.
Or will there be, with a common enemy removed, will there possibly be much more religious fighting between extremist groups and
Right.
religious wars? I mean, sort of what have you thought through about those issues?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting question. I want to clarify one thing, though, is that in the sort of medium term, in terms of religious immigration, that's not actually leading to a rise of fundamentalism. It's leading to religious stability. It's desecularizing. But actually, the religion of, say, Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims in Britain is not Salafism. It's not sort of fundamentalist. So it's just, what its meaning is simply that religion is holding its own or growing. It's only in the longer term time frame of several centuries that the sort of ultra-Orthodox, neo-fundamentalists, etc., that they will have a larger share of the population. Now, it's a good question. Well, what is going to happen as such groups increase, as the ultra-Orthodox, for example, increase? Are they going to become more realistic? I think so. I mean, I think when a group takes power, you can see this in Iran. The Shia regime, the revolutionary regime, takes power and then begins to realize, well, actually, if we don't do something to control fertility, we're going to be facing revolutionary pressures, high unemployment, and that's going to threaten our regime. So because they actually had their hands on the levers of power, they then had to take some action, and so they managed to get the right fatwas that would back up family planning. And actually, it turns out it's not so hard to do in Islam, because it's not so, you can find passages, just as you can in all religions, that would justify some family planning. So I think, paradoxically, it would moderate some of those tendencies which are stronger in opposition.
You touched on homosexuality with the Proposition 8, and I was wondering if the gay rights movement is something like a flashpoint that affects all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's the gay rights movement would be one issue in which there would be, that could be a banner issue for fundamentalist politics throughout the world, along with, say, abortion or, it depends. It could be the school curriculum. I know we did some. One of the interesting things, at least in the U.S., is that in fact, opinion on that issue seems to be going in a more liberal direction. It seems to be a less important issue even for fundamentalists than abortion. So it does seem to me that the momentum towards that probably can be sustained for a while. Although, even so, and the other point about gay rights is that it seems like Latino Catholics are not as opposed to gay rights. They don't seem to be as conservative on that issue as on the abortion issue. So demographically, if you just take the U.S., if you look at the demographics of this, it will affect that issue less than, say, the abortion question, where I think, some of the work that I've done with my colleagues at the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria, I think we did some simulations based on attitudes here. Hang on. Just based on attitudes, if we were to take the fertility rates of women who oppose abortion or are in favor of it, or the fertility rates of women who oppose homosexuality or are in favor of it. And that question does not address gay marriage as much as simply your opinion on homosexuality. And depending on your assumption in terms of immigration and in terms of fertility, you come up with different scenarios. I think the general view is that with homosexuality, we're looking at a kind of stable basis of attitudes, whereas when you look at abortion, the proportion that are opposed the demographic momentum seems to be pushing towards a sort of pro-life as we move towards the end of this century. So it just depends, again, on the issue to some extent. Yeah.
Did you find that there was a demographic component to the secularization of Europe and the United States? In other words, what happened from a demographic point of view that permitted that to take place, particularly in Northern Europe and the rest?
Right.
Was it a demographic issue or not?
I don't believe it was. I think in the case of Europe, it's largely if you imagine a treadmill, the seculars kind of have to run to stand still because of their fertility disadvantage. I think that fertility disadvantage is increased because of contraception, because of all those second demographic transition things I talked about. But it was always there. However, secularism was just moving so quickly and so, in the 20th century that it rendered the demographics relatively unimportant. So, in a time of rapid social change, demography is less important. At a time of polarization of attitudes where you don't have a lot of movement sociologically, that's when demography takes on a bigger role. So I think it's just a case of secularization moving faster. Right.
What role do you see economics playing in what you're proposing? Because I'm thinking if people, say for instance in the United States and the Latinos that you mentioned, if they are not economically empowered, how much are they going to be driven to having more children or to even be more religious?
Yeah. Well, I'm relatively skeptical of the argument that ties religion to being poor or less educated. I think, however, that there is a relationship in terms of being poor or less well educated and having larger families. So to the extent that the Latinos do not rise up the economic ladder, then their fertility will fall more slowly and will remain higher. So it's about, I think in 2006 it was about 2.84 was the average number of children per woman. compared to 2.08 for the U.S. average. So it's quite a significant advantage. But I think it's going to decline, but you're right. If they aren't empowered, then it'll decline more slowly. And so the knock-on effect in terms of the maintenance of Catholic religiosity will be correspondingly higher in that regard. So, yeah.
Okay, so last question?
Thank you very much. This is obviously an immense and very complex subject, and the issue of causality is an important one. For example, if you take the case of Israel, I don't think that the high birth rate among Palestinians is a religious one, but it's more a political one.
Right.
And similarly for the ultra-Orthodox, you could find some reasons that are not totally economic. You cited the case of Iran, where most people consider that to be a rather religious society, but they have a rather low birth rate due to national policy. And you're taking such a long sweep of history, 100 years, 90 years. I mean, a lot of things could change in that time. Western Europeans, Christians, could become more defensive and concerned about the fact that maybe they're diminishing as a percent and become, encouraged to have more children and so on. And this, similarly for Mormons, who are a small percentage of the population and so on.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, demography, it isn't destiny. It's one part of the picture, and other things can change. I'm not saying that there is a portion of demography that is automatic, which is the aging of, the young people today are going to, the 50-somethings of the 2050s have already been born. So to some degree, we know that Britain will become a more Muslim society, Europe as a whole, some of the religious trends I mentioned. But you're right, of course, there could be, maybe there'll be a big change in the Muslim world as a result of the Arab Spring, and there'll be a theological shift, and all of a sudden they'll start behaving like Afro-Caribbeans and assimilating in large numbers. That's all possible. There's no question about it. But I just think the working assumption has to be, or at least that I'm basing this on, is this link between population change and religion. Yeah.
You said you had your own thoughts about the Arab Spring.
Okay.
You have to share them.
Well, what my thoughts about the Arab Spring are that I think that if you looked at surveys of people in the Muslim world, there was no link between their degree, the strength of their, say, support for Sharia or of Islamism and their support for democracy. So you had a large number of people who were quite strongly conservative Islamists and quite strongly democratic. And so I think this is an issue that really binds together strong Islamists and more secular-oriented people. However, I think looking demographically, the young part of the population is the part of the population that gravitated to Islamism more strongly, and I don't think that's changed as a result of this. And so I think we should expect to see the influence of Islamism continue to grow. That would be or at least remain at its current level.
Well, the other thing you mentioned that we can't let go is, without further elaboration, is the quiverful movement.
Right.
If you'd explain that.
Yeah, so the quiverful movement, and I think I have a slide here, which could be, sorry, where am I here? Hang on. Yeah, so this is a movement, I don't know whether you've heard of it, and these may be the sort of incipient Haredim of neo-fundamentalism in America. I know people have different views on this, but this is a movement, and this is based on a passage here. Children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. And this is the passage that this group looks to justify its position on family planning. And so their view is that God should be the family planner, and therefore you have as many children as you can. In fact, there have been known to be quiverful churches where women get together, and women who can't have more than, say, 4 children think they have, think that they haven't been chosen by the Lord, and they see this as very traumatic. And quiverful movement leaders talk about a 200-year plan for domination. simply through higher birth rates. As everybody else's birth rate declines, they think that in 2 centuries, as long as they manage to keep the children in the fold and with high birth rates, they should be able to sort of re-evangelize or the nation. And actually, what I've argued is actually that kind of a model is the most successful model in a Western secular society, to have high boundaries against the secular culture and grow your own is a more effective growth strategy in the West than to be evangelizing and proselytizing, because through that process of opening up to the surrounding society, you often lose as many as you gain. Whereas this method of erecting walls and growing your own seems to actually produce some of the fastest growing religions in America. The Amish are actually one of the fastest growing religions in the United States. It's not Pentecostalism. It's not these many megachurches. It's actually groups that consistently double in population over, say, 25, 30-year period in a country where perhaps birth rates have gone down or where the population may even begin to decline. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, Dr. Kaufmann, we will invite you back in 200 years for an update. Please join me in thanking Eric Kaufmann.
Thanks.
His book is Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And for those of you here, the copies are on sale if you're interested in following up. Thank you.